Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. We're going to talk about intents and specifically how they work with activities within an app. Now, an intent can be used with a service and some other components of an Android application. But I want to limit our discussion of intents right now to just activities and only intent messages that are passed within an application itself. We will talk a great deal about intents in this course, so just stay tuned. First of all, what is an intent? An intent is a message, that's all it is, between components of an application or potentially between components of two or more applications. But in this unit, again, we look at how intents are used within an app to first start a new activity, pass data to another activity, or return data from another activity. And these don't have to be exclusive. In other words, we could start an activity with an intent, pass the new activity data, and get data back from it. So we can combine all of these operations within one intent if we make our calls the right way. So let's look first at how we would start a new activity from an existing activity. Well, the first thing we're going to need is a new activity class. So this is some subclass of activity or one of its subclasses. Once we have that class, and let's say it's called My New Activity, we add an activity entry in the Android manifest file for this new subclass. This must be there if we intend to use an intent to start the activity. So the minimal specification here is that the activity tag within the Android manifest file must have a name attribute, and that name attribute must be the name of the new activity within the package of your application. So if we're in the same package, then we just use a dot here. So the activity name recognizes that dot my new activity is within the package namespace of your application. The next thing you need to do is create an intent, and this is pretty simple. The intent has several constructors, but the one we're interested in is the one that takes a context and the class of your activity. So we create a new intent by initializing intent to a new intent, passing it usually this, which is the context that the intent is going to be fired from, and of course this meaning the activity that we're in, and then my new activity.class. That means that if your class is named my new activity, we want to take the class of that activity. Finally, we start the activity with that intent. So start activity is the method, or this dot start activity, and then the intent we pass in, and that tells the system to fire up the new activity. So what is this intent thing really? The intent is a message that says fire the new activity. The message in this case has no content. So could we send the new activity content? In other words, could we send the new activity a data payload within the intent? Sure we could, and that's what we're going to look at next. So to send data, first of all, a lot of this stuff is the same. We create a new activity, we add the entry for it in the manifest, we create the intent. All of that is the same. But the difference is we put the data into the intent as key value pairs using the put extra method of the intent class. So intent put extra, and then the key is a string. That's what we're going to refer to this data on the other end when our new activity when we want to get it out. So the key is a string, and then the value can be almost anything you can think of. It could be a string, it can be an integer, it can be a Boolean, it could be just a single character, it can be an array of any of these primitive types, it can be an object, it can be nearly anything you can think of. So we put that extra as a data payload within the intent, and we can put as many extras as we want. So in this case, I put up an extra called name, or with the key name, and the value Arthur, and I put an extra age, and then the value 42. Finally, as before, we call start activity with the intent as the parameter, and that will start the new activity. So that sends the data over to the new activity. How do we get it out? Well, on the other end, we want to fetch the data from the intent. So we can do this in code by just saying get intent, in other words, get the intent that I was passed, and then get the typed extra. So in this case, I get a string extra with the key name, and then I get an age extra or an int extra with the key age, and I assign those to a string called name and an int called age. And then finally I do something with that data, whatever I'm going to do with it, but the important thing is that we have passed data from one activity to another with the intent. So now what happens if we're in the second intent and we want to pass some data back to the first intent? Naively, we might think, well, all I would have to do is create a new intent and then point back to that activity within that intent class, main activity.class, let's say, and then start that first activity with the intent with a data payload. The problem with that is that by doing this, we create a stack of activities in memory. So the first activity calls the second activity through an intent. The second activity calls the first activity through an intent, and back and forth and back and forth. And if the user does this several times, then we could fill up memory and crash the app, and that would be a bad thing. So how do we get around this? Well, the answer is to use the same intent that we used before. So to get data back from a new activity, first of all, we need to create the new activity. We make the manifest entry. We create the new intent exactly as we did before. We can also pass data to the new activity using extras. So we can put extras into the new activity. Then the first difference is in the old activity, in first activity, the intent is called through by using the start activity for result. And here we pass the intent and an integer. The integer is within an application. It's basically an ID. Now, if we're going to an intent or if we're going to an activity in another application, these have names. So let's say we're going to a system activity or a system service maybe, like the address book. That's content provider, but the idea is the same. We're going to another service that would have an integer that is assigned to that service. What this ID does within an activity or within a single application is it tells us the intent we pass in is the same as the intent we're getting back out. So what do? In the next activity, in the new activity, we get that very same intent using getIntent, just like we did before. And then we do whatever we need to do to get the new data to be sent back, and we add it to that intent as an extra. So we are using the same intent both inbound to the new activity and outbound back to the old activity. To set it, we call setResult for that activity with its intent, the intent that we just added stuff to. So the result, the activity.result OK is a result code. It's in this case it's saying that my result here, I certify it as my new intent to be okay for you for the old intent or the old activity to consume. And then we pass back the intent. Now, to make sure that this second activity no longer is in memory, we call finish, which destroys the activity. So when we're done and we're ready to dismiss this activity, we call finish, and it'll be deleted. So now we've got an intent sitting out there that was generated by the first activity, had an extra put into it by the second activity. It's sitting out there, and where does it go? Well, when this is done and a result is set, then in the first and the first activity resumes, I should say, there is a callback method called onActivityResult. And that is what we override to get this result. So onActivityResult has three parameters: the result code, the request code, and the intent itself. So you can see where this is going. The result code we're going to check against Android.result.OK. Well, we set it, hopefully, in the new activity. So when we come back to the old activity, this result should be Android.result.OK. The request code should be that same integer value that we passed to start activity for result. And if it is, then we know that it is the same intent. And finally, we retrieve the data as usual, get extras, and then get string value, get int value, get bool value, whatever, from the intent and use it. So to send that data to an intent, we put extra in the old activity. To retrieve data from an intent in the first activity, we put the extra into the same intent we sent to the new activity, and then set the result, and it sends it back to the old activity so that we can use it. This is a little bit confusing, I know, just to sit here and talk about it. But in the demos, there are 3 demos. The first one just shows a simple intent that fires a new activity. The second one shows passing data to a new activity. And the third one shows getting data back from a new activity. And then after you view those 3 demos, then you'll be prepared to do the assignments, and that will finish up this unit of the course. Intents are extremely important and very useful in Android development. Thank you very much.